Here are some lessons learned when rigging characters in Moho 12. Specifically, I was comparing rigging using the grid approach for elbows and knees versus the smart bone approach. So the first point is animation just takes a lot of time no matter which approach you use, and the more simple that your character is, the faster you can construct a character, but it just takes a lot of time. Okay, so first let's talk about using the grid approach. This is really best suited for simple characters, specifically characters that are simple around the elbows, the hips, and the knees. So for example, this band is a good example where it's much better in the smart bone approach, because in order to create this armband, it's going to have problems if the armband is smaller than the circle or the width of the arm. And as you see here, I actually had to construct the arm in kind of a special way, where the arm had flesh tone and then the band and then flesh tone again. And yet I also have to have this bottom line for the circle. And so this is really, in the grid approach, we actually have the upper arm and lower arm. So the upper arm is actually coming down and making this circle, and then it has kind of like a cap or an endpoint here that is for the band. In addition, for the waist, I had to create a very strange construction here, because this bone was not exactly centered in the hips. So I've kind of figured out some things, but it's much easier to use the smart bones. So in the smart bone approach, you just can draw exactly the way the figure looks. The next thing is, if you're going to use smart bones for the elbows and knees, especially if you've got a complicated rig, but even in a simple one, you want to use that dividing line. It's not as important when you're doing grid rigging, because you already have an upper arm and lower arm. But in the smart bone approach, we typically might create the whole arm as one shape. And if you don't use the dividing line kind of situation, you'll get gaps if the bend is too severe. So for example, this bend would give you a gap if you didn't use the dividing line. So in this particular case, I have the whole arm shape is one ellipse, in essence, with a dividing line here and a dividing line here, which I did a shape in the upper arm, a shape at the elbow band, and a shape at the bottom layer. And then these other shapes, the trims, are just separate shapes. So if I'm doing just a flesh color without this extra armband, I would want to have a dividing line here because of that bend issue. So as we think about binding, for beginners, it's good to teach them to use the bone binding, point binding to the bones. But for any sophisticated rig, really for the torso in particular, you want to use flexi binding. So it's probably good to even give a course on the different bindings. So flexi binding for the torso, point binding for everything else except for the head. You want to do layer binding, same thing perhaps for the feet. But in this particular case, I did the feet with point binding. But the head really is best to do layer binding because you've got all the different sublayers. And I've kind of mentioned this a little bit. What makes it difficult to do the rigging? It's the elbow and the waist. It's usually you don't have much at the knee, but of course, so anywhere where the character is going to bend significantly, make sure that you don't have too much complication there. And in particular, for the shoulders, it's just a good idea to have the round shoulders. Now, in this particular character, these shoulder pads actually help it look more sophisticated. But the rotation just needs to rotate everything as a unit. So with respect to the rotations, especially in the grid approach, I learned some interesting things there. So the complex thing in this construction was the fact that we've got a fairly thin body, and the bone, when I put the bones out, was not exactly centered in between the waist here and the legs, and so this, where I want the bending of this torso to be, is not just centered, and as a result we get this weird shape here. So this curvature here is like a circle for the left leg. This is like a circle for the upper leg, excuse me, I mean the torso. So as the torso is going to move, so right here, as this port of the torso, as I move it back, I want this to kind of have a circular arc as he bends backward. The same thing here, this point here with the hip, as he bends forward, needs to have a circular arc if that torso is bending. And then here, what we have is the left leg, as it bends up this way, has to have a circular arc. And then on the right leg, as it bends back, this needs to be circular. So that's the right leg needs to be a circle. So the key point about this is that we don't have to have a complete circle. We really only need quarter arcs. Now, in doing the grid approach, we want to set the grid settings to 5. And when we do that, we'll see that the torso is aligned to one of the grid settings. And notice, in this particular case, in the waist, when I've got this one point here and I want it to, as it comes up, I want it to be circular, what I'm going to do is I'm going to count off the number of grid lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have to have 8 grid lines vertically as well as horizontally. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so that has to be circular. Now, to make that circular arc, what we want is one end will be have the curvature set to 0, and the other end will have a Bezier handle go out to the complete edge. So as we turn this on, we see that I set this point's curvature to 0, so there are no handles. But this one, I pull the handle all the way out equal to that point, and that gives me a perfect circular curvature. And I use that exact same technique for the hip. If this were the shirt, that part of the shirt, if it were to come up like that, we do the exact kind of same thing, even though it's a larger radius. As we look over here, we can see this handle. So this point up here has a Bezier handle that comes all the way out here, and this has 0 curvature. And actually it doesn't have to be 0 curvature, you just need to bend the handle 90 degrees. So the shirt is going to cover both of these points here, so it doesn't matter that there's a discontinuity there. I use the exact same technique for the hip because the biggest concern area is when that left leg comes forward, and so we have 0 curvature at this point, and then have the handle come all the way out at the bottom point, so that's a curve. Now for the right leg, I just have it having a normal semicircle. So a point here, and a point there. So you just need to think about the rotation, which part is going to kind of stay fixed, and which part is going to be the circular part. So the layer that is furthest behind is the one that you want as circular. So since this leg is the furthest behind, it is circular. Whereas in this particular case, the left leg is in front of the waist, so it's the waist that is circular, and the torso is in front of the waist, so each side of the waist above the hip is circular because it's behind the torso. The other thing is I think about the simplified rigs or improvements to rigs. Probably you don't need a collar or neck bones. If you want those subtle movements, that can be helpful, but really it turns out that they just kind of they're more in the way than helpful, because you really don't need those subtle movements most of the time. If you're going to use the grid approach, you want to avoid layer transformations for all of the layers that are instrumental in the rig construction about the elbows and knees. The reason is that you need to get the bones to line up with the artwork, and the the grids are associated with the layer, not with the whole project. So in this particular example, notice that this grid, we have a scaling here, and so you really want to set all of those to 0. And in particular, the top level bone layer can have the scaling, but it's all the ones underneath that you don't want to have either scale or position offset. Also double check on flipping. And finally, no matter what, copying between characters is really the way that you're going to get the fastest creation of new characters. In particular, the body shape, whether they're thin or thick, you can copy different heads between there, because the heads have a lot of things that all kind of go together, and I could just add a different head onto this character. So that's probably the best way. You know, if you know how to animate and do the rigging, it's probably easiest to do that. Now, for very simple characters and just trying to get quick animations, one good way to do things is to just have the character already set up, and with the layers, mainly just the very basic kinds of things. So, for example, the left arm might have 2 portions, or actually, if you're doing the smart bone version, you'd have just one arm, and make sure you've got 3 points on either end, and then points in the middle just to give it shape. So with the basic construction, you can easily just drag things over quickly and create whatever type of character that you want. And so we have the layers already set up, and you could have the styles already set up, and you can have just the basic outlines. And that way, then you can layer things on top easily. Okay, so those are the lessons that I have for today. Hope it's helpful.